assignment. I can't fix what hurt you. Always overdue.
I'm J-Jax, and today I want to talk about how I made my song Late featuring Isla. It's an R&B hip-hop song that's quite soft, and I released it around the summer, and the story behind the song is quite interesting. I also like how I produced the vocals for this one, and also the featuring vocals from Isla, which were just immaculate. She's an amazing songwriter. Yeah, let's jump straight into it. This is what the session looks like. It's quite minimal compared to the productions that I usually do. We have the effects, we have some instruments comprised of guitars, piano, electric piano, and harp. We got drums, not a lot of tracks for the drums, it's just a basic loop, and strings during the arrangement process for the bridge, and just one bass line and some vocals. Very simple minimum production. Now, how did I start making the song? It starts with a guitar loop. I actually heard the sample during my trip at Pohang. I was just walking by the ocean side, and I wanted to write one song at least during that trip. So I was just digging through Splice. Maybe there could be a melody or like a chord that could give me inspiration. And this guitar chord hit me, and I was like, oh my gosh, like this is amazing. What I did instead was I reamped the whole thing. I pitched it to key. I really like this plugin, by the way, for guitar amps. It's the Chandler by Plugin Alliance. Highly recommend it. And on that is just a basic Alicia Keys following the chord progression of the guitars. And this was actually something that I made during my trip at Pohang. I wrote most of the first verse, but yeah, this is what the demo sounds like.
J-Jax. I've been late to many meetings, say the least. Promises I'm meant to keep, added to my felonies. What's the point of staying on beat with just a broken melody?
I basically had the ideas all jotted down in during my trip at Pohang. So there is an additional guitar lead, which is panned left and right, the counter melodies. So then we have some strings that goes along the intro so that we work our way into the verse. I actually wanted this song to be almost therapeutic, and I wanted the intro to also represent that type of therapy where we're slightly opening up a bit to our emotions. I automated an EQ. It's a low pass filter, and it goes straight into the verse.
J-Jax. I've been late to
For the verse, we have the same loop, basically, same piano. So that's continuously being repeated in the song. And I just added some drums. Very simple drums. A kick, snare. So it sounds like this. The snare, I wanted this to sound like a very analog snare that's like really dry, but also like kind of dirty and not really modern. So the original sample sounds like this, but I added a compressor, 1176. I just slammed it, and then some transient shaping and some distortion, and I do a bit of leveling with the Wavesell 2 just because I like doing that. So no reverbs. That's usually not my style, but that's pretty much it. So it sounds like this. But because I thought this snare needed a little bit of sizzle, I added a little bit of noise on top as well. So it's originally this, but I really filtered out the low end. So I add that to the snare. That little bit of sizzle along with the snare I thought actually made a lot of difference for me. It kind of captures that blunt emotion. And then I add a little bit of hats. But along with the drums, what was important for me was I needed a little bit of that ear candy and also a little bit of that J-Jack's special energy sauce. And I was just like, how can I make the production sound not really that cliche? So what I did was I added scratches. So that's what the drum loop sounds like. So let's listen to it with the instruments. And then we should check out the vocals, of course. And this is my vocal chain: a de-esser, some Pro Q, a clipper to actually catch the peaks, then another 1176 to catch the peaks, an LA2A, some more de-essers, and dynamic EQ. And then I use a bit of Pultex to sculpt, design the curves, Mag EQ to make the air push through a bit, Decapitator always, and an RVox because I thought the vocal needs to push through even a bit more than Soothe. And I just use L2 as a leveler. I don't know why I do that, but I like doing it. So yeah, that's my style. For the verbs, I have Seventh Heaven. So Seventh Heavens are for chambers and plates. I have a slap delay that kind of puts all of the vocals on the same space because I also put slaps on the background vocals as well. And I have an eighth delay. And I just use H delay because I'm a lazy bum. For the background vocals, I process each individual track, then I catch the peaks, I compress it, and I shape it. And I also got the same slap delay. I also have a chorus effect and reverbs specifically just for the background vocals. So let's give it a listen.
I've been late to many meetings, say the least. Promises I'm meant to keep, added to my felonies. What's the point of staying on beat with just a broken melody? And can keep blaming my way. Memory, natural hungry, there was silence. Put
in the middle, I put an ad-lib that's almost like a riser. And I thought this actually goes pretty well with the rest of the arrangement because in the same part, I actually have a cello that transitions the verse nicely into the bridge.
been always with you, but I don't have another damn excuse.
Now, for the bridge, it's almost conversational. What I mean here is I intended the song to be almost therapeutic, as I said, and it's talking about how there's a person who's trying to achieve their dreams, reminds you of someone, and that person is late a lot of the times, as in he's late to meetings, he doesn't sometimes even reciprocate to the people around him, and the people that wait for that person are often very tired, and the conversation between those two parties exists specifically in the bridge. The arrangement completely changes. We no longer have the guitar nor the keys. What we have is a Rhodes first. Nothing special, just playing the same chord progressions, and a harp. But what I did was I added an RC20 to give it a bit of a wobble, some distortion, and a little bit of space. And then I added a resonant filter for a little bit of movement. I panned it, I auto-panned it, and I also put in a modulator. So the frequency also adds a little bit of movement in the arpeggiator as well. So that's what it sounds like. And then in the middle, we also have another guitar counter melody that plays along. And we then have another cello that builds up to the hook. Let's check out the vocal production again. And I want to emphasize, I could not have made this song without Isla. She's an incredible vocalist. Again, check out her music. She actually released something recently, which I think is just dope. As I said, it's a back and forth conversation between the two vocalists.
I need more time, little bit more than I can provide, yeah.
That's just what you want, we already passed the line.
But I'm really close to getting everything we dreamed of.
What do our dreams ever align?
All I need.
So, what I had a problem with when I was mixing her vocals was, number one, it's a totally different recording chain. So my recording chain is, I use a tube microphone called the Peluso 2247 LE. So it's a very rich and a very warm microphone. And I record that through a Neve 1073 mic preamp. For Isla's vocals, we recorded it at the studio. Booming Studios, by the way, shout out. They really helped me out. Shout out to also BJ, who's the owner of the studio, and also other staff members as well. What we used there was the U87, the Neumann, a Neve, and we routed that through the CL1B compressor. Very different chain. The vocals turned out to be much brighter just naturally compared to what I recorded at home. So I had to use a completely different process. I did some filtering, and then I used an L2 to catch peaks, another 1176, an LA2A, which I thought really worked well for the song. Did some de-essing, Pultex again, Decapitator, but very different settings, another mag, and Soothe. The reverbs, I have a sunset chamber, I have the plates, but I also added a fourth delay for this vocal because I thought her vocals need a little bit more echo to it. And I also added a doubler, which is something I normally don't do, but I wanted her vocals to kind of feel like they're wider because they need to encompass more space compared to my rapping style. And then we got her background vocals, which are also just incredible.
What do our dreams ever align?
Her harmonies are dope. So the hook's pretty much the same thing, but what's different is I added a bass line, a bass element, but the bass actually is also a string bass. It's not an 808 or a Reese bass, which is usually what I use for other productions. So let's check it out. So, very different from what I normally do, right? But I also added my own sauce, my own processing on this bass. So, it's originally just a Kontakt sample. So, I added an imager just to make sure that the low end is mono. I added an LA2A again here, just for some tone. Another Pro Q, and then L2 for leveling. But I thought this wasn't enough. So what I did was I added another amped version of this bass and added some harmonics. So this is BX Green Screamer. It's actually a free plugin by Plugin Alliance. It's a guitar amp plugin, but I think it's amazing. I use it a lot of the times when I want to really overdrive something. And I put this to the bass, and I EQ'd a lot of the top end and made it so there's additional harmonics that I could feel for this string bass. So if I add the Green Screamer bass here, it sounds like this. It's very gritty compared to the original source. The hook sounds like this. And then another vocal chop. Now, I really want to talk about the vocal production for the hook as well. The hook has two vocals, two lead vocals working together, my vocals and Isla's vocals. So it's a duet where we harmonize each other's melodies.
I can't fix what hurt you. Always overdue. No, I had you wait every time I'm late, but almost there on my way.
The processing for the hook was different from how I processed the verses. I needed both vocals to not stand out but work well together. So the EQs that I also used were quite different from what I would normally use. I sculpt the EQ for Isla's vocals quite differently from how I would usually sculpt the leads for the verses. For the hook for the male vocals, I actually used a different microphone. I borrowed a C414 XLS just for the hook because I wanted the sound to be very flat and I make sure that my vocals don't overpower Isla's. So the processing for the hook vocals is very different. As you can see, it's much simpler compared to how I process the verse. You have EQ basic compression with the 76 and the LA2A, and for the next stage, I shape the EQ by cutting out a little bit of the high end. So I'm making space for Isla's vocals to keep that space, but I'm also boosting the low and mids a little bit so I can sit in that space. And also what I did was I really slightly panned my vocals to the left. It's just like 3% and Isla's vocals to the right. So it seems like we're in the same space, but standing next to each other. So if we listen to it,
I can't fix what hurt you. Always overdue. No, I had you wait every time I'm late, but almost there on my way.
now let's move on to the second verse. The second verse is pretty much the same as the first verse. It's just the same guitar loop and piano chords, same drum line, but there's this part where we harmonize again.
We're not getting young and do not have forever. No, it's getting late, but I'm still waiting for the come up. But no.
I really love that part. But after my second verse, the arrangement totally changes. So what I did was I recorded additional guitars instead. Very simple arpeggio. Then I added some keys. It's almost like a chime, very soft and very wet. And then the guitar lead changes. It was a bit boring, so I added also like an additional piano, grand piano to the chords. But what else? So what I had to do was I needed to find another instrument that can actually accompany Isla's vocals. So I decided to add strings. There were some string elements in the previous parts, just a cello as almost like a fill. But now the strings play a really big role. We have a swell, and then the strings play chords, and also I pitch it up. I use violas, violins, and I also change the voicings a little bit so the strings sound much fuller. But what I want to emphasize here is the strings, they actually vibrate a little bit because I sidechained it to the movement of the kick. But then again, I could not have done this if I didn't get Isla's demos for her verse. And I thought right after she sent me her demo, I was just like, okay, like she's a genius.
In love.
How long till you show me you're worth my time? Get my feelings all inside. Why is loving you so hard inside? I'm just waiting in line all night. I ain't sure what I'm holding on for. You said just a little more. Promises don't make it right. Can I give you my all?
Immaculate. She's amazing. Like, I really want you guys to listen to her music, and she's so down to earth. Shout out to Isla. So yeah, after hearing those vocals, that's when I really started to work on the string parts. But what I felt a bit, I wouldn't say missing, but I think could have just what I should augment a bit from her vocals was there's a little lack of the oomph factor, and I think it was because the microphone was so bright, and I also mixed it so that the highs really pop out for her vocals. So what I did was I pitched down her vocals for certain parts that I really wanted to emphasize.
Can I give you my all?
It's barely audible, but it gives that foundation for her vocals, especially when the vocal melodies start to build up.
Sure what I'm holding on for. You said just a little more. Promises don't make it right. Can I give you my all? I must just do what with this. Ready to die out of fire. Yeah.
We again return to the hook. And the hook is not really that different, pretty much the same concept. But here, I want to emphasize on the amazing ad-libs that we have for the vocals.
It's what hurt you. Always overdue. No, I had you wait every time I'm late, but
So it's very wet. It's probably similar to what other people do to their ad-libs. I processed it like how I would process like a normal vocal, but I filtered out the low end a bit more. I also added another doubler, some reverb, and delay afterwards, and then again some filtering of the low end and also the high frequencies. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Late is a very, very personal track for me. I wrote it when I was having a really hard time and I wanted to clear my head, and that really helped. So, two things to take away from the song. First, when you're stuck, actually go on a trip. For me, it really helped. I like that trip was what made this song. And secondly, work with someone who can really inspire you. So originally, I was kind of against working with people because I'm kind of an introvert, and I really like doing things by myself. I'm always at the studio and I try to produce and mix my own stuff. But working with another vocalist really helped me be inspired, and I was able to think of other ideas so that I can complement the song that I already produced with other arrangements. And she also offered great ideas as well. So travel and collaborate. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Please listen to the song. Thanks.
no, I had you wait